I first came across the name the Leatherman in a courthouse basement in Fairfield County, Connecticut, where old land records are kept in boxes that still smell faintly of damp paper and iron staples. It wasn't folklore yet in those documents. It was administrative, marginal, a problem someone needed to note and move past. The entries were brief: unknown male, observed repeatedly, wears clothing of leather, does not speak, no accusation, no praise, just presence. What caught my attention wasn't the clothing, it was the pattern. Across 3 counties, spread over several years, the same man appeared on the same days within a margin of hours that suggested intention rather than chance. Farmers recorded him passing at dawn. Railroad workers noted him before lunch. Families wrote that he accepted bread, apples, sometimes tobacco, and left without a word, always moving, always alone. No one could agree on where he came from, but everyone agreed on something else. He never missed his route. This wasn't a legend built from exaggeration, it was a schedule. By the 1860s, people along the Connecticut New York border had stopped asking his name. They marked time by time instead. He'll be there Tuesday. He passed last night. You just missed him. He wore a suit stitched entirely from scraps of leather, not decorative, not symbolic, functional, patched and repatched until it resembled armor more than clothing. The weight of it would have been unbearable for an ordinary man walking 30 miles a day, yet witnesses described his pace as steady, unhurried, as if the road itself said it. Children were warned not to follow him, not because he was dangerous, but because he never turned around. When I traced his path on a modern map, I realized something unsettling. The route still exists. Roads have widened, trees have been cut back, but the line remains, a looping circuit nearly 400 miles long, crossing rivers, ridges, and town centers that no longer remember why their oldest paths run where they do. I decided to walk a portion of it, not to reenact him, not to romanticize him, but to understand what kind of man could vanish into motion so completely that silence became his identity. I didn't expect to feel watched, but standing on that old road at dusk with the sound of modern traffic fading behind me, I understood why people never tried to stop him. You don't interrupt something that clearly knows where it's going. By the second day on the route, the terrain began to explain him. The road stopped behaving like a road and started acting like a decision. It bent away from easy ground. It crossed creeks where bridges had once existed and climbed ridges that offered no view worth the effort. This wasn't the shortest path between anything. It was a loop that insisted on being completed exactly as it was. That was when the numbers began to matter. In letters preserved by local historical societies, families had counted him, not casually, meticulously. One journal from a farm near Brewster listed his arrival every 34 days for nearly a decade. Another, after farther north, recorded him one day later, consistently, as if he were a moving equation solving itself across the countryside. He walked roughly 30 miles a day. Rain or heat made no difference. Snow only slowed him, never stopped him. When storms flooded the roads, he adjusted, but always returned to the same line once the ground allowed it. He carried almost nothing: a wooden staff, a sack for food, occasionally a piece of twine, no weapon, no bedding. When offered money, he refused it. When offered shelter, he declined with a shake of his head and a single gesture toward the road ahead. Witnesses disagreed about his age. Some said he was young and scarred. Others swore he was old, his face creased deep beneath the leather hood he sometimes wore. What never changed was his silence. He did not speak, not even when spoken to in multiple languages: French, English, German, Irish. Doctors speculated he was mute. Ministers suggested a woe. One newspaper theorized brain damage from an accident at sea. None of those explanations accounted for the discipline. Silence can be accidental. Routine cannot. As I followed the route, I began to notice how precisely it intersected with human kindness. The places where he was most frequently recorded were also the places where people left food outside without being asked. Porches, stone walls, tree stumps beside the road, almost as if the landscape itself had learned his needs. He didn't forage, he didn't hunt, he didn't beg. He relied on memory, not his own, but the memory of others, and that dependence should have made him vulnerable. Instead, it made him permanent. By the late 1870s, to tell their own children when to expect him. Entire communities synchronized unconsciously to the movement of a man who never announced himself and never stayed. Walking the same stretch, I realized how difficult it would be to stop, to settle, to explain yourself to someone when your entire existence depended on not breaking the line. The road wasn't just where he walked, it was what kept him alive. And for the first time, I wondered whether he was following the route, or whether the route was preserving him. The leather was never meant to be a costume. That became clear once I saw the remains. In a small museum room in Ossining, New York, the kind that opens only by appointment, a fragment of his clothing is kept behind glass, thick, hand-stitched, darkened by age and oil. Up close, it looks less like clothing and more like a solution. Layer over layer, sewn not for warmth but for endurance. The curator told me the suit weighed nearly 60 pounds when complete. No one could explain how he wore it year-round. Accounts from farmers described him sweating through it in summer, steam rising faintly from his shoulders in winter, yet he never removed it in public. When children once tried to touch it, their parents pulled them back, not out of fear, but respect. The leather had become him. Separating the two felt wrong. For years, his face was only described in fragments: a scar along the jaw, one eye slightly lower than the other, a breath that grew unevenly. People remembered different men because they never saw him long enough to assemble a whole one. That changed in March of 1889. He was found in a cave near Mount Pleasant, collapsed beside his fire pit. The cause of death was exposure, complicated by cancer of the mouth. The disease explained his silence, not as a choice, but as a condition that would have made speech agonizing. His name finally was discovered inside his clothing. Jules Berglay, or possibly Jules Berglays, a French immigrant, a leather worker by trade. After decades of speculation, the mystery seemed to resolve itself into something ordinary. A man in pain, a craftsman wearing what he knew how to make, a body failing quietly along a road it could no longer complete. But the simplicity didn't sit right, because death should have ended the pattern. Instead, the pattern continued. Newspapers printed his obituary. Towns held small memorials. His body was buried in Sparta Cemetery, marked with a simple stone. People said it was over. Yet diaries written after his death still mention him, not as a ghost, not as an apparition, but as a presence. Footsteps at the expected time, food left untouched and later found gone, dogs barking at empty stretches of road. I stood near one of the caves he was known to use, its entrance black even in daylight, and tried to imagine the last moments of a man who had never stopped moving. What unsettled me wasn't the idea that he might still be walking. It was the possibility that the walk-in itself had outlived him, that the route, once learned by enough people, no longer needed its origin, and that silence, practiced long enough, doesn't disappear. It transfers. After his burial, the road should have emptied. That's how these stories usually end, with a name, a body, and relief. The mystery collapses into biography, and whatever lingered is dismissed as habit or grief. But when I compared records before and after 1889, the entries didn't stop. They changed. Before his death, people wrote he passed today. Afterward, they wrote something passed. The wording mattered. In Ridgefield, a schoolteacher noted muddy footprints on the same morning she had marked for years. In Katona, a shopkeeper recorded bread missing from a windowsill he no longer expected anyone to visit. No one claimed to see a man. They described motion without a figure, disturbances without origin. At first, I thought this was nostalgia, reshaping memory, communities clinging to routine after losing it, but the timing was wrong. The entries were precise. They aligned with the same 34-day circuit, adjusted only for weather, exactly as before. Routines can be remembered. Schedules cannot be invented collectively. Walking that stretch myself, I noticed how the route avoids places where no new roads cut through. It clings to older lines, footpaths absorbed into asphalt, service roads that seem to exist for no modern reason. If you follow it deliberately, you're constantly stepping slightly aside from contemporary life. I began to feel that separation physically. Sounds dulled. The air felt heavier, not threatening, insulated, like walking inside a habit rather than a location. Cars passed without slowing. People glanced but didn't look twice. I wasn't invisible, but I wasn't engaging with anything either. It struck me that this might be the real inheritance of the Leatherman, not a ghost, a behavior. For decades, people had adjusted themselves to him, left food, noted time, made space without conversation. And when the man was gone, the behavior remained, still moving forward, still expecting to be completed. At one point, near an old stone wall, I found an apple placed deliberately on the flattest rock, fresh, unbitten, no house nearby, no explanation. I didn't touch it, because I realized something then. The road doesn't belong to the man who created it anymore. It belongs to the people who learned how not to interfere. And once a community agrees to look away together, whatever passes through that gap doesn't need a body to continue. The most unsettling part of researching the Leatherman wasn't what people said about him. It was what they refused to say. In towns along the route, modern residents often know the name. They can point you to a plaque or a museum case, but when I asked older families about habits, about food left out, about timing, about the road at night, conversations shortened, voices lowered, answers became practical instead of historical. That's just how it's always been. No harm in being polite. Some things don't need attention. This wasn't fear, it was training. Silence, when practiced collectively, becomes a form of order. And order doesn't require belief, only participation. You don't need to think something is real to behave as if it might be. I found a letter dated 1902 from a woman writing to her sister in Albany. She mentioned leaving bread out even though the man is long buried. Not out of superstition, she explained, but because stopping felt disrespectful. As if the road itself might notice. That line stayed with me. Roads don't notice. People do. But people had been aligning themselves to this movement for so long that it no longer felt optional. The discipline had become invisible, like grammar. You don't remember learning it. You just know when something sounds wrong. One evening, as I reached a bend where the old road narrows between trees, I became aware of how quiet I was being. Not consciously. I hadn't decided to slow my breathing or soften my steps. My body had adjusted without instruction. I stopped walking. The silence didn't break. It thickened. There was no sound of pursuit, no sense of danger, just the feeling that speech would be a mistake. Not because it would summon anything, but because it would violate something already in progress. That was when I understood why no one ever tried to ask him questions. The Leatherman's silence wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a standard being set. And once a standard exists long enough, it doesn't need enforcement. People enforce it on themselves. They lower their voices. They avert their eyes. They leave food and keep moving. The road doesn't demand this, but it rewards it. And standing there, alone, saying nothing, I felt for the first time that I was being measured, not by a presence, by whether I knew when not to speak. Patterns only feel supernatural when they are intact. To understand the Leatherman, I stopped looking for where the route continued and started looking for where it failed. There are gaps in the records, not many, but enough to notice. Days when he should have passed and didn't, places where food was left untouched, moments when the schedule slipped. Those moments never ended well. In 1874, a farmhand near Peekskill wrote that he decided to follow the man just once, curious where he slept. The entry stops mid-sentence. 2 days later, another hand noted the first man had returned confused, unable to explain where he'd been. His boots ruined, his sense of direction gone. He never followed the route again. In another account, a tavern owner blocked the road deliberately, piling crates across it as a joke. The next morning, his cellar flooded after a night with no rain. The barrels closest to the road split. The rest were untouched. He removed the crates and never spoke of it publicly. None of these stories were framed as punishment. That's what made them credible. No one claimed revenge. No one said the man did this. They described consequences instead, as if interfering with the road introduced error into a system that corrected itself impersonally. Walking the path, I came across a section where construction had cut directly through the old line. The original trail disappeared beneath concrete, but a few yards to the side, a narrow, unofficial track had formed. Trampled grass, bent brush, a way around the obstruction that didn't exist on any map. People had remade the road without discussing it. That realization unsettled me more than any ghost story could, because it meant the Leatherman no longer needed to appear for the pattern to be enforced. The discipline had become distributed. Anyone could maintain it by stepping aside, by not blocking, by allowing motion to continue. Late that night, I heard footsteps where no one should have been walking. No behind me, not ahead, beside me, perfectly matched to my pace, separated only by the trees. I didn't turn, because I understood what breaking the pattern costs. Not terror, orientation, and losing your place on a road that doesn't stop moving is far worse than being followed. By the seventh stretch, I understood why no one ever tried to end the road. You can interrupt a person, you can bury a body, but you cannot easily dismantle a function once enough people rely on it. I kept my pace deliberately steady, resisting the urge to slow or hurry. The road here narrowed into a corridor of old trees, their roots lifting the ground just enough to force attention downward. Every step felt counted, not in distance, but in compliance. The Leatherman had become a mayor, not of time, but of restraint. Records from the early 1900s show a subtle shift in language. People stopped referring to him at all. They wrote about the day, the passing, the quiet morning. The subject dissolved, leaving only the event. This is how folklore hardens, not through exaggeration, but through omission. You remove the face, you remove the name. What remains is expectation, and expectation repeated often enough behaves like law. I noticed how easily I was adapting. I avoided eye contact with passing houses. I stepped around obstacles instead of moving them. When a fallen branch blocked part of the path, I went around it rather than over it, preserving the line instead of challenging it. No one told me to do this. That was the problem. The leather suit had once explained the discipline, its weight, its endurance, its silence. Without it, the rule should have weakened. Instead, it had become lighter, easier to wear, because it no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to the road. As dusk settled, I felt the accumulation of steps, not mine alone, but thousands layered beneath them. A century of careful avoidance, of chosen quiet, of people deciding it was simpler not to interfere. That's when the thought occurred to me. If the Leatherman had ever spoken, even once, the root might have collapsed. Because speech invites response. Response invites deviation. Silence, on the other hand, continues uninterrupted. And by continuing, it teaches others how to continue after you're gone. By now, the route felt less like history and more like responsibility. I stopped taking notes aloud, not out of fear, but because narration began to feel intrusive, as if describing the road while standing on it altered its balance. Instead, I wrote later, away from the path, when the silence had released me. That distinction mattered, because the people who lived along this road had learned something specific. You don't observe it while you're inside it. You participate or you leave. Several late accounts mention outsiders, surveyors, journalists, hobbyists who tried to document the phenomena directly. Their efforts rarely produced results. Equipments failed. Schedules didn't align. The route seemed to empty itself when treated as an object instead of a process. One journalist in 1923 complained that nothing happened despite weeks of preparation. His article reads irritated, dismissive. Locals responded with polite deference. They knew what he'd done wrong. He had watched. He hadn't walked. The deeper implication unsettled me. If understanding requires participation, then knowledge comes at a cost. You can't remain neutral. You either adopt to the rule or exclude yourself from it. Near a bend where the trees thin and the road briefly widens, I found another offering, this time bread, wrapped carefully in cloth, recent, still soft. Someone had come here intentionally. I realized then that the road is still active not because people believe in the Leatherman, but because behaving otherwise would require explanation. An explanation draws attention. Attention disrupts rhythm. So the system protects itself by rewarding quiet continuity. That's why the records fade instead of climaxing. That's why there is no final encounter. Because the cost of truly knowing what walks this road is that you become part of what keeps it moving. And once you understand that, the question stops being who was he. It becomes how long are you willing to carry something forward just because it's already in motion? There's a point on the route where records stop mentioning outcomes and start mentioning absences. Not deaths, not disappearances, absences. Men who moved away suddenly, women who no longer walked that way, families who adjusted routines without explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to archive, nothing violent enough to remember loudly, just quiet withdrawal. I found one ledger entry from 1911 that bothered me more than the rest. A man I'd seen before, someone who had tracked the road carefully for years. The final note read, "Stopped marking the days, no longer necessary." That sentence isn't curiosity ending, that's surrender. Walking that same stretch, I understood the temptation. The road doesn't threaten you. It doesn't chase. It doesn't demand belief. It simply continues and offers you relief if you stop resisting its rhythm. You can stay. You can blend. You can let the walk-in replace the asking. That's the danger no one writes down. Not that something will happen to you, but that nothing will, and you'll decide that's preferable. By the 10th stretch of my walk, the road itself began to feel like an entity, not simply a path. Every stone, every bend, every worn patch of dust seemed deliberate, as if centuries of footsteps had pressed it into shape with a will of its own. I was no longer just following a historical trace. I was moving through the memory of a man and the rhythm of everyone who had ever respected it. The sun was low, filtering through the branches in pale streaks. Shadows stretched long across the narrow trail. I could hear distant farm animals settling in for the night. But the forest corridor around me had its own quiet pulse. It was a silence built not for absence, but of expectation. Every footstep I took felt measured against that expectation, and I realized I was beginning to anticipate it naturally, adjusting unconsciously, without instruction. Local accounts described the towns adjusting themselves to him, creating a network of observation and accommodation. But as I walked, I sensed something more intricate. The route wasn't just about people obeying a pattern. It was about the space learning them, about the roads themselves responding to those who moved respectfully through them. Every footfall, every pause, every glance away or step aside became part of the ongoing ritual. There was an old stone wall lining a field, partially collapsed in places, yet the trail hugged its base perfectly. People had recorded offerings there, bread, fruit, small tokens, yet none remained now. Still, I felt the residue of them, a lingering sense that human attention once aligned with this space could persist even after it vanished. I could almost sense the continuity, the invisible thread connecting observers across decades. Walking further, I noticed subtle changes in the terrain, a soft indentation here, a flattened patch of grass there, markers not on any map, telling me silently where others had passed and waited, where the rhythm of their movement had guided the road. My awareness sharpened. I became conscious of every breath, every shift in weight, every leaf-crunching step. It was clear to me now, this was not a road merely walked. This was a road taught, a road that imposed itself on anyone who entered with attention, guiding movement without coercion, instructing silently, shaping both body and perception. And as night threatened to fall, I realized that I was no longer simply tracing a history. I was participating in it. Each measured step, each careful navigation of terrain, each moment of silence had meaning. I was learning the pattern without even realizing it, internalizing the discipline that had allowed the Leatherman to persist in memory after the man himself had vanished. The forest thickened around me. The air cooled. Distant lights from farmhouses flickered in the distance, yet the road remained clear, unwavering, waiting to lead me where it always had, insisting I move with it, not against it. And for the first time, I felt the weight of being observed, not by a person, not by a figure in leather, but by the rhythm itself. The road, the rhythm, the memory of the man, they were one and the same. This was no longer just history. This was a lesson. By the 11th segment of the road, the landscape had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Hills rose higher, streams cut deeper, and the path narrowed into a corridor of forest so dense that the last hints of daylight barely reached the ground. Every step demanded attention, every movement felt measured, and I realized that the road was testing me as much as it had tested those who came before. I passed a small clearing where an old stone foundation rested, almost forgotten. Local records suggest a home once stood here, but it had been abandoned long before the Leatherman's era. Yet the road curved precisely around it, as if respecting a boundary, leaving the ruins untouched. That was when I began to notice patterns in the minutiae. Bends, dips, and rises not required by geography, but by something older, something deliberate. The farther I walked, the more I understood that the Leatherman's road was not about speed or even distance. It was about presence. The road demanded observation without interference. It required adaptation. It shaped those who walked it into quiet participants in a ritual that spanned into decades. I found a small offering on a tree stump, an apple, half rotted but unmistakably left intentionally. No one had seen me place it, no one had seen anyone, yet it belonged to the continuity of the movement. Every detail mattered because each act, however small, contributed to the persistence of the pattern. I became aware of the rhythm, my footsteps in sync with the history of those who had walked here, my breathing echoing the pauses of generations. The landscape itself seemed alive, guiding me, assuring that the discipline of silence and motion was preserved. The deeper I went, the more I felt that every observer had left an invisible trace, shaping the very air. This was the core lesson, not in seeing, not in recording, not in recounting, but in moving with purpose, quietly, deliberately, and respectfully. That was how the Leatherman endured. That was how the route continued, decades after the man was gone. And as twilight bled into night, I realized that understanding the road was not about comprehension. It was about participation. The road demanded it, the road taught it, and those who walked without learning or who attempted to disrupt it, were quietly corrected, not by force, but by consequence. After that moment, I understood the truth that had escaped so many historians and storytellers. The Leatherman was never the man. He was the pattern made flesh, the silent law of motion that outlasted flesh, leather, and memory. Night had fully descended by the time I reached the final stretch of the path I had set out to walk. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and decaying leaves. My footsteps felt heavier now, not from fatigue, but from the weight of understanding. Every mile I had traveled had layered lessons into my perception, lessons not about a man, but about the road, the rhythm, and the silent rules that governed both. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches forming a near tunnel over the trail. Moonlight filtered through in thin streaks, illuminating the worn path beneath my feet. I could feel the cumulative movement of centuries pressing down, not as a threat, but as a presence. I was part of it now, whether I wished to be or not. At a small clearing, I paused. No markings, no offerings, just a quiet space where the path widened briefly. I closed my eyes, listening, not for voices, not for footsteps, but for the cadence embedded in the land itself. The road remembered. It remembered the discipline, the silence, the routine, and it remembered that anyone who respected it, even decades later, became part of its continuity. I realized then that the Leatherman had never been a ghost. He had never needed to be. He had been a man of flesh and leather, yes, but what endured was far greater. The principle of movement, of ritual, of silent observation repeated through generations. It was the community, unknowingly trained, that had carried him forward, preserving him in absence as much as in presence. I took a final step, leaving the clearing behind. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into darkness, and I felt a profound shift. The path was complete for me, for the observers, for history, yet it would continue unbroken, carrying its lessons forward. My footsteps would fade, replaced by others, but the rhythm would remain, guiding, correcting, enduring. Standing there, I understood the truth the towns had always known but never spoke aloud. This root is alive. It outlasts men, it outlasts memory, and it teaches those willing to listen that silence, discipline, and respect for the unseen pattern can endure far longer than the flesh that once walked it. As I turned away, the clearing emptied behind me. The path waited, patient and silent, ready for the next person who would enter and begin walking in step with something older than any of us could name. The Leatherman is gone. The road is not.